Hi, I'm George Maestri. Today we're going to take a look at digital humans in 3ds Max. And this course will basically cover how to create basic human characters that you can use in visualization for architecture and other things. So we're going to start off with a little bit of background and some resources that you can turn to. And then we're going to use the cat animation system to create some skeletons. We're going to skin a mesh to those skeletons, and then we will animate those characters. And then we will go ahead and follow up with the Biped plugin for 3ds Max. And again, we're going to do a quick overview of Biped and then create some characters and animate them. So if you want to create characters for your visualizations, let's go ahead and get started with the course. If you want to follow along with the exercise files that accompany this course, go ahead and download those now and place them on your desktop. Now, the exercise files folder is a 3ds Max project, so it has some very specific folders and directories. And once you're in 3ds Max, go ahead and set this folder as your project, and then we can get started. Now, this course is for people who are fairly new to character animation. So, before we get started, let me just give you a little overview of the character animation process. Now, it all starts with a mesh. So, here I have a character, and if I turn on edge faces, you can see it's basically just a mesh that starts off as an editable poly. Now, that mesh is deformed by what's called a skin. Now, that skin attaches the mesh to what are called joints. So if I were to say hide this, you'll see that underneath all of these objects, and those are joints. Now, these may look different depending upon the type of animation system you're using. But what we're really doing is we're animating the bones of the character, and those bones in turn deform the skin. So let's go ahead and unhide all. So if I were to say select this hand, this particular skeleton will pose just by moving the hand. And so as you can see, by moving that skeleton, it basically deforms that mesh. So what we're going to do in this course is we're going to first show you how to do this attachment to the mesh, and then we will do some animation. Now, typically, when we work with meshes, we like to use low-res meshes because it's much easier to attach a few vertices to the joints than many. So typically what we do is we take a low-res mesh and then we add in a modifier on top of the whole stack. And this is basically we use either mesh smooth or turbo smooth. And what that does is it smooths out the mesh and makes it look a little bit more realistic. So you can see it's kind of chunky here, but as soon as I turn on mesh smooth, you can see I'm getting a much smoother mesh. So what we do is we basically take a skeleton, attach a mesh to it, smooth that mesh, and then we can manipulate the skeleton to animate the character. Now let's turn our attention to 3D characters that can be animated. Now, when you animate a 3D character, you will need what's called a rig, and that's just a collection of what we call joints or bones, and those deform the mesh. Now, 3ds Max supports three basic types of skeletons. Now, if you've downloaded a character using FBX or from a third-party service, typically, if that character is rigged, it will be rigged using basically bones. And that is something that looks like this. And these are just generic helper objects that allow you to deform the mesh. Now, these don't have any sort of intelligence, so any animation that you do will have to be from scratch or imported using motion capture. Now, if you want something a little bit easier to use, you can use what's called procedural rigging or procedural skeletons. Now, 3ds Max has two basic types. The first is Biped, and that's this one here. And Biped was part of the original 3ds Max many, many years ago. So it's kind of an old and mature technology, but it hasn't really been updated all that much. But it can work for certain situations. Now, the other one is what's called a cat rig. And that is a little bit more flexible, allows for a lot of different body types, and it is a little bit more recent in terms of development. Now, one of the really nice things about both Biped and Cat is that they can do what's called procedural animation. So you can do some basic animation just by pressing a few buttons. So if I press play here, you'll see that each one of these can actually walk automatically. And so the biped works by laying down what are called footsteps. And then the cat rig basically has a walk cycle that you can tune parametrically. And you can also set that along a path to make your character walk along a path. Now, which one you choose will depend a lot on the project, but I find that for architectural situations, biped or cat are probably the best because typically what you have is you just have characters walking around. But I find the cat is more flexible than biped, and so we're going to concentrate on that in this course. Now, if you want to add 3D people, particularly ones that you want to animate, you may need to look for 3D models. Now, there's a number of different places where we can find those. So typically, I like to go into Google and just type in something like 3D humans or something like that. And this will bring up a number of different results. Now, one of the types of assets you'll find are 3D model libraries. One of my favorites is TurboSquid, but there are plenty more. Now, TurboSquid has characters, and you can go through and basically find any type of character you want, and you can get those with or without rigs. Another really good resource is called Render People, and this allows you to download models that are already textured and ready to go. Some of them already have motion capture on them. So you can bring down 3D people that are already posed. You can bring down rigged people that you can animate. Now, if you're using 3ds Max, this is a really great resource because it will provide you with different types of rigs depending upon how you want to animate. And going even further, you can also download stuff with motion capture. Now, a lot of these are paid, so you will have to pay a little bit of money to get these. Now, if you want something that's pretty easy, all you have to do is go into Autodesk. Autodesk has a utility called Character Generator, and you should have it if you have a 3ds Max license. All you have to do is sign in, and this will allow you to create whatever type of character you want. So in this case, we can create different types of females or males, whatever we want. And if we click on one of these, we can actually customize these. So if I click on customize, you can customize the head. So basically, we're fading between two different people. So this one's Stefan and Johnny, but we could do Johnny and David or one of the other. And again, we can crossfade between these. We can change the eyes to go between one or the other. And so this is a great way. Basically, what you're doing is you're taking multiple characters and combining them. And you don't need to use the same characters for things such as the eyes. And so, for example, if you want a little bit more cartoony eyes, you could do that if you want. And then you can go through for everything from eye color to type of hair to, say, clothing or something like that. So there's really a lot of different options. Now, once you've created your character, all you have to do is click Finish, and that will go ahead and finish your character. Now, I'm going to cancel this out. And once you've created a character, you can go into what are called generated characters. So this is a character that I've generated. So what you can do is once you have all of your values dialed in, you can then generate your character and download it. So there are a number of different ways to create characters. You can download models from the internet. You can go to services that give you completely rigged characters, or you can use things such as Autodesk's character generator. When you get a stock 3D character from a library, or if you generate one using Autodesk Character Generator, typically you'll get something that looks like this. And so this is a basic character. If I select on this, you can see that it is a mesh. And inside that mesh, you have what are called joints or bones. So if I hide that mesh, you can see I've got all of these bones, which basically mimic the bones in the human body, and they're used to deform the mesh. So if I unhide that mesh and maybe freeze it, you can see that I can select any one of these joints. And if I select one of these joints and just rotate it, you can see I can actually manipulate the character by animating those joints. Now, what type of skeleton you use will depend on how you want to animate. Now, 3ds Max has three basic types of skeletons. This is the most basic, and that's just a skeleton comprised of joints. Typically, we get these if we import an FBX file or download from a service. 3ds Max also has two more types of human skeletons that can be a lot easier to animate. One of them is called Biped, the other one is called Cat. Now I'm going to go ahead and unfreeze her. And the other thing you want to take a look at is the actual texture on the character. So if I select her and let's go into my material editor, I'm in my compact material editor, and here I have her material. Now, the material for this character is basically just comprised of bitmaps. So for the base color, we have a bitmap that looks like this if we zoomed in. So as you can see, all parts of the character are inside one texture. And so you can change that texture to change to a different type of character. So this is great. So you can rig one character and then just basically swap out textures to get different types of characters. So I have couple of different ones of these. So I have this one here, which is actually a male character. So all we have to do is just change that texture. So I'm going to click on this bitmap here, and you'll see in our scene assets images, we have a couple of different ones. So I have this sci-fi character. So if we want to turn her into a sci-fi character, we could. We also have a male texture. So we could add that male texture, and because of her body shape, she still looks female, but you can see how this changes the look of the character very easily by swapping the texture. So I'm going to go ahead and put her back to the original. And when you have a character like this and you want to rig it in something else, you can delete the skeleton as well. So in 3ds Max, we use a modifier called skin, which attaches that character or that character's mesh to the skeleton. If we get rid of that, then the skeleton will no longer deform the mesh. And typically, if we go into Scene Explorer, you'll see that we have the skeleton here. Typically, these bones are in their own hierarchy. So if we were to select this and do a expand all, you can see we have a ton of different types of bones here. So I can just select them all and delete them if I want. And now if I've deleted these, I will have to rebuild a skeleton for this character in either Cat or Biped, or you can do it using 3ds Max's tools. So when you get a 3D model from a library, you will need to adjust things such as textures and materials, and you may need to change out the skeleton for the type of rigging that you want to do. Now let's go a little bit deeper into the CAT tools and take a look at how to create CAT skeletons. Now you can find the CAT tools under the Create menu, Helpers, and then there should be a pull down called CAT Objects. Now the one we're looking for is CAT Parent. So let's go ahead and click on that, and you'll see we have a number of rollouts. The one I'm looking for is CAT Rig Load and Save. And so there are a number of preset rigs already out there. So if I were to click on Base Human, left click and drag, it would create a skeleton that looks like this. If I were to select Cat Parent again, and maybe select Biped 01, and left click and drag, you'll see I get something that looks very similar to 3ds Max's Biped. And in fact, that is almost equivalent. So you can actually move data between the two if you want to. Now, you're not limited to human types of characters. So if I go to cat parent again, you can see we have all sorts of different ones. So if I select horse, I can bring in a skeleton for a horse. So each one of these is very, very different. Now, once you've created a cat skeleton, you can go over to the Modify panel and just select this triangle at the bottom. And that's kind of the main node for each one of these skeletons. And if I go into that, you can see I can change what's called the units ratio. So I can make it taller or shorter. I can change what axis the bones are aligned with. Typically, we want to keep it with X, but if you're using game engines or something like that, you may have to change it. And then if we want, we can also load and save additional rigs. Now, if you were to click into the rig, let's go ahead and say click this thigh, you can see that this limb has different values as well. So this one is telling me that this is the right side of the character. If I click on this one here, you can see that that's on the left side. You can also tell it what part of the character it's in. By saying ankle, that means that this one is eventually connected to the ankle, so it's part of the leg. And so, for example, in this horse skeleton, we've got a couple of different bones before the ankle. And so this gives us the ability to do that. So in other words, this has 3 bones before the ankle, and the human only has 2. Then we can give the bones a name. We can also give it a length, a width, and a depth. So you can scale these however you want. Now, once you have a skeleton created, you can skin it to the mesh. But if you select the main node, you can also animate it. So if I go over to this motion panel here, you'll see that I have the ability to assign controllers. Now, if I have the main node selected, I can also add in something like a walk cycle. So if I left click and go down to this walk here, if you press this play button, you can see that now I'm getting animation very simply. Now, the animation features in CAT are based on layers, and so we can layer animation as we see fit. And I'll get to this in a later chapter, but just understand that this is there and that we can use it. So as you can see, there's a lot of different ways to create skeletons using CAT, and these can serve a lot of different purposes in your animation. Now let's go ahead and fit a cat skeleton to a mesh. So I have this mesh here, and it's just a basic businesswoman. And let's go ahead and freeze this mesh before we do anything, because what we're going to be doing is working with the skeleton, and I don't want to accidentally select this mesh. So I'm going to go ahead and right click, and let's just do freeze selection. And I'm going to go into wireframe. So now I have this in wireframe. And let's go ahead and create a cat skeleton for her. So I'm going to go into my helper menu, cat parent. And for this particular character, I'm going to do a Biped 01 as the base cat rig. Now, this will give me probably the most human-like control over this rig, and I can also work with motion capture if I want. So I'm going to go ahead and position right around 0, 0 on the grid, left click and drag. And so what I'm looking to do is make this about as high as her. Now, the thing is I'm looking at mostly the hips. So I'm going to go ahead and let go of this. This is at 0.332 here. And then let me show you what I'm looking at here. So I really want these hips to be lined up properly and the legs to be centered. So this rig, I want to make sure that these leg bones are pretty much going down the center of the leg. Now I can certainly move this forward a little bit, but from the left-right perspective, it's correct. Now, Here we can adjust this as needed. So we're going to go through and start adjusting this. So the first thing you want to do is you want to make sure that the hips are correctly sized. Now, if you didn't get it right on the first time, you can always hop over to your modify panel and we can change our units ratio to get the value that we want. And then what you want to do is you want to start positioning the skeleton so that it fits this mesh. So we're going to start at the bottom and let's take a look at this foot bone here. So I'm going to select right foot. And if you're in the modify panel, you can see how we can change this. So we can change the length, the width, or the height just to match your character. So I'm going to select here, and this is basically the toe bone here. Let's zoom in on this so we can see it. And so what I want this to do is I want this to be about the same length as that foot. So the first thing I need to do is I need to change the number of bones. I don't really need 3 bones in this, so I'm just going to bring it down to 1. We're going to do kind of more of a stylized skeleton here. And then I can change the length of this. So I'm going to change the length of this to about 9 or 10, somewhere in that range. And then I can change the width and the depth of this as well. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get this to fit with that foot. Now, once I have this, I can now mirror that. So I only did the right leg, but I also want to do the exact same thing on the left leg. And so one of the nice things about CAT is that it has tools that allow you to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and select this thigh here, the right thigh, and we're going to do copy limb settings in the modify panel here. And then I'm going to select the left side and we're going to do paste and mirror. And what that will do is that will go ahead and change it so that this has the exact same foot arrangement. So now that I have the lower half of the body set up, we can move on to the upper half. So just remember that you can move and manipulate bones fairly interactively. And I typically work on one side and then paste to mirror to the other side. Now that I have the lower part of the body set up, we can work with the upper half. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit. And so the first thing we want to do is just kind of start and work our way up the spine. Now, in this case, the character's spine is pretty much in line here. If we want, we can move these a little bit to get a little bit more of that arch in the spine. But the most important thing is that we want to make sure that these shoulders are centered. So I'm going to go ahead and select one of these upper arms, and let's just go ahead and rotate it pretty much horizontally. And then I'm going to select one of these spine joints. I'm going to select this one that's second from the top. And we're just going to scale that up just a little bit so that that bone is centered. Now, once I have that, I can start to work with the arm. I'm going to start with the shoulder. And again, we have very similar options here under our modify panel. So I can change the number of bones, which would be the number of bones in the arm. But the most important thing is that I can actually change the size and scaling of this. So if I want to, I can make it a little bit longer. Now, another way to do this is to simply select and move the bones that are a little bit further down the chain. So if I wanted to, I could select this bone here and maybe even go into a top view here just to make sure that it's centered to this. And then I can select this elbow and move that. So you can see here we've got a little bit of detail here where this kind of comes out. And so that's really where I want to put that elbow. And the same goes for the hand. So really what I'm doing is I'm just moving these very interactively. I can move them, I can rotate them, and I can scale them. So I want to make sure that that hand is aligned. There we go. And then I want a little bit of a bend to that elbow. So that way it bends properly. And then with this finger, again, we're going to do the same thing that we did with the toe. And so I'm simply going to change the length of this to match kind of the size of the hand. And then if we want, we can match the width and the depth. Now, if we wanted to, we could add 3 bones to this, and that would make it kind of more of a bendable hand. And so it just depends on how you want to animate this. If you want, you could have multiple fingers. In this case, we're just going to move the hand a little bit like a mitten. And so we really don't need that much detail in the hand. And these are going to basically be low-res background characters. But you can certainly go down and rig these on a finger-by-finger basis. Now, once you have this arm here, you can again select that clavicle, copy limb settings, and then paste and mirror over to the other side. And so now you can see I've got the exact same settings on that side. Now, all we have to do after this is just get the rest of the skeleton, which is basically just the head. So what I want to do is just select this head, and again, just move it and position it so that it pretty much matches the head of the character. And I could scale this up if I wanted to match exactly, but that's not absolutely critical for this particular character. So now that I have this, I have a good basic skeleton with which to skin the character. Now, once this is positioned properly, you should have a fairly smooth and seamless skinning process. Now that we have our skeleton matched to our mesh, we can do a skin. Now, skinning allows the mesh to deform according to how you animate and move the skeleton. Now, we can find the skin modifier under modifiers, animation, and then there should be skin. But we do need our character selected. So let's select our character. We can also find our modifier here in the modifier panel under skin. So just scroll down to the letter S, and there we go. So once we have this modifier on our mesh, you can see we've got a number of different parameters. The one we're looking for initially is adding bones. So you see here we have bones add. Let's go ahead and click on that, and it'll bring you into a selection box. So the bones that we want to use to modify this mesh is basically everything from pelvis down. So I'm going to select pelvis and do display, expand selected, and that expands everything under pelvis. Let's go ahead and just shift select everything and hit select. So now these are all modifying our skin. So these bones will control how the character deforms. So if you want, you can see how this works by clicking on this Edit Envelopes button. And you'll see that we have a number of different lines here. So each line represents a bone in the character. So if I select this one here, you'll see that this particular bone affects this part of the mesh. And we also have this kind of capsule. It's called an envelope. And I'll get to those in just a little bit. But in order to actually tweak the mesh, we will need to animate it just a little bit. So I'm going to zoom out, select my mesh, and then let's go ahead and freeze it. And this will allow me to select a number of different bones. So each bone in the character can be highlighted. So what I want to do is just do some basic animation. Now, I can't just animate on the timeline. We are using cat rigs, and so animation has to happen within that system. So I'm going to go ahead and select my main cat node and hop over to the motion panel. And here we have what's called a layer manager. And so I need to add in an animation layer in order to keyframe this. Now we have a number of different ways to animate within CAT. Now I'm going to get to these in just a bit, but the one we want is ABS for absolute. And this basically just allows you to keyframe it like you would anything else. So in order to see this layer, you will need to press this button here, and that turns it green. And at this point, you can start to animate your skeleton. So I'm going to go ahead and select this left foot. Let's go ahead and turn on auto key. I'm going to go ahead and set a key for this. Move the timeline forwards, maybe say 10. Move that up. And you can see that, yes, it is deforming the mesh, but we are having a bit of a problem here, which we will get to. And then I tend to just set keys for everything here. And if I want, I can maybe move that down and out so I can see how it affects the hip, maybe even rotate that foot a little bit. And then if I want to return it to 0, all I have to do is select this key at 0, hold down Shift, and then just drag that. So now we've got a nice little cycle. And we could do this for other parts of the character as well. So let's go ahead and select maybe this left bicep. And again, I'm just going to go ahead and set a key here, move forward a bit, drop that arm to the side, maybe set another key. And then if I want, I can copy that first key to the end. So now I've got two motions here. And this will allow us to work with the shoulder as well as the leg. Now you can certainly add more deformations and more motions if you want. And it's really just going to depend upon how you want to skin and modify your characters. So go ahead and get your motion in place, and then we'll come back and tweak the mesh. We now have our mesh skinned to our skeleton. And if I scrub the timeline, you'll see that we also have some basic animations so that we can see how our deformations work. Now we're going to start broad with fine-tuning those deformations. We're going to start with what are called envelopes and then go down a little bit more granularly to the vertex level, and then we'll do some fine-tuning. So let's start off with envelopes. Now in order for this to work, I will need to select my character's mesh. So I'm going to right-click and do an unfreeze all. I had that frozen. And now if I go into my skin modifier, I can click on Edit Envelopes. Now, one of the things I notice is that when I click on, say, an envelope that's here on the shirt, which is a lighter color, I can see the shading very easily. But if I go down to the pants, which are a darker color, it's kind of hard to see how that fall off works. So I'm going to do a little trick before we actually get started. So I'm going to turn off Edit Envelopes. And let's go into the material editor. I'm in the compact material editor, and I just want to eyedropper that character. And there she is. It's called Body Low. And I'm just going to go ahead and turn off show shaded material. And so that will give me a very neutral color. And now when I select envelopes, I can very clearly see exactly how those fall-offs work. Now, another thing you might want to do is turn on edged faces so you can kind of see where the wires are as well. So let's go ahead and start off with this leg. As you can see, when her foot comes up like this, you'll see that this isn't really working the way that we want. And that's because some of these vertices here are falling outside of this envelope. Now, these envelopes are completely adjustable. One of the things you can do is you can physically move them. So if I were to say, click on one of these, I can actually click on this dot here and use my move tool to actually move that. And you can see that as I move it, it changes what's affected. I can also click on this outer one here and just grow or shrink that envelope. And so one of the things I'm noticing here is that it's kind of basically bleeding over into the other part of the character. And then this inner envelope here is basically your 100% mark. So it goes from 100% down to 0 at the edge. So if you want a little bit more effect on the inside of this, you can certainly dial that up. Or you can select the outside and dial it down if you want. And so by changing that, you can see that I've already affected how that particular part of the mesh works. So now those vertices are actually following the leg. I'm still getting a little bit of a divot here. And then my knees, we can change that again. So I can select this and maybe make that a little bit bigger. Or make the inside of this a little bit bigger as well. So I'm going to go ahead and select this inner one here. And again, just move it. And you can see how that's starting to affect that knee. And so it's going to make that knee look a little bit more realistic. Now, in addition to this, you can also add in subdivisions to an envelope. So I have this envelope here. If I want, I can scroll down to cross sections. And if we want, we can add in cross sections to our envelope. So if I click here, you can see I'm adding in additional cross sections. And those cross sections can then be adjusted as needed. So in other words, I could select this and just adjust it. So you can get a very fine grained deformation here. So if I wanted to, I could bring that in just a little bit. And again, what you're trying to do is basically just surround this portion of the mesh with the envelope. And as you scrub, you can see how that works. Now, this is really kind of a back and forth, a very iterative process. So now that you understand the basics, go ahead through the left side of your character and get your envelopes adjusted the way that you want. Now, once you have the rough envelopes in place, you can then go down on a vertex by vertex basis to adjust your skinning. And we'll talk about that in just a bit. Once your envelopes are set up, you can now start to fine tune this by going down to the vertex level. So I'm working mostly with the lower part of this character. Now, as I've said before, this is a very iterative process. So I'm just going to focus on the lower part of this character, and you can expand that up to the rest of the character. So in this case, you can see I've got that leg moving. Now, when the leg kind of comes up here, you can kind of see we're getting a little bit of a divot here. Now, some of that is a little bit of a red herring. So this mesh will ultimately be smoothed out. And so we're just showing you the low res version of it. So if I go over to my modifiers and just toss a mesh smooth on top of that, you can kind of see that this will smooth out a little bit more evenly. And so we can toggle that on or off so we can check to see what the final product will look like. So when you mesh smooth, sometimes the low poly version may need to be a little bit exaggerated to get the effect that you want. Now, let's go ahead and start working with vertices here. So I'm going to select my mesh. I'm going to turn off that mesh smooth, and let's go back down to the skin modifier. We're going to select edit envelopes. Now I can select individual envelopes here. And as you can see, this knee kind of needs a little bit of work here. So even when I turn on mesh smooth, you can kind of see it's kind of wonky. It's not exactly aligned the way that we should have it. So we can adjust this on a vertex by vertex basis. So in order to do that, what you want to do is select vertices. And you do need to have an envelope selected because we're adjusting vertices per envelope. So let me show you just with one vertex, and then we'll go out to multiple here. So I'm going to go ahead and select this vertex here. And let's go ahead and scrub this animation so that you can kind of see it a little bit. So I'm going to go maybe at about frame 3 or so. And if we scroll down, you'll see here we have what's called weight properties. And this is how much that particular envelope is controlling this vertex. So this vertex is controlled by the lower leg at this rate. So if I want to, I can dial it up or down depending upon how I want that to be affected. So I can select another one and again dial it up or down. So we can use this to fine tune how this mesh is deformed. So if, for example, I could select multiple vertices here and I can affect them all evenly. If I scroll up, you'll see that where we have select vertices, we can also select a loop. So I'm going to go ahead and select this edge loop here. And let's go ahead and adjust those. And that's about halfway between the knee and the thigh. So I'm going to put it somewhere around 0.5. So this one here, let's go ahead and select this loop. And we can adjust that effect like this. Now, there's a number of other tools that we can use to adjust these vertices. We have what's called the weight tool. Now, this will tell you exactly what bones are affecting any individual vertex. So if I were to say select this vertex here, you can see it's affected by the thigh and the calf. Now, if I scrub forward, you'll see that we have this vertex here, and that's kind of an anomaly here because what we're getting is we're getting this one is affected by the wrong leg. So the left leg is affecting the right vertex. So I can select this vertex here and select the right thigh and make that 1. And that will go ahead and make the left thigh 0. And what that does is it basically takes that out of the equation. We can do the same for this here, and that one's basically affected by both right and left. So I'm going to go ahead and select the left half, make that 0, the left thigh, make that 0. And again, we're not getting that effect. And you can see that also here. This one is affected by the right foot, even though it's on the left side of the character. And again, we can 0 those out. Now, in addition to this, we also have what's called a weight table. So if I select a vertex, I can go into the weight table, and that will tell you exactly what vertices are controlled by which bones. So as you can see, we've got a number of different ways to control how the mesh is deformed on a vertex by vertex basis. So your next assignment is to basically just go through the character and make sure that all the vertices are the way that you want them. So now let's go ahead and finalize our skinning. Now I've already done some of that work. I went through and I added in some additional animation so I can get the head and some more arm motion. So I have the wrist bending here, the head dipping, and then the elbow bending as well. And I've dialed in my envelopes and my vertices as best I can. Now, one of the things I noticed with this particular skeleton was that a lot of these bones towards the back were not reaching the front, so I had to really mess with the envelopes to get those into the solution. Now, once you have your mesh pretty much the way you want, you can also mirror from one side to the other. Now, remember, I was only working on the left side of the character. And so if you scrub this up, you can see here somewhere around 60 or 70, you can see I'm still having that problem with the leg that I had before. So this leg doesn't have it, and this leg does. And so if I go into edit envelopes, you could even see that this particular leg has a much more sophisticated envelope. It has a lot of cross sections, and this one doesn't. And so what I want to do is I want to copy all of that stuff on one side of the character over to the other. Now we can do this using what's called mirror mode. Now I'm going to turn off vertices and just leave edit envelopes on. And then either scroll down, or actually I'm just going to go ahead and make this box a little bit bigger and then turn on what's called mirror mode. Now, mirror mode allows you to copy from one side of the character to the other. Now, how does 3ds Max know which side is which? Well, that's what's called the mirror plane. So in this case, it defaults to X, which is actually the correct solution. Now, if I were to change this to say Y, you can see that this mirror plane is now on the bottom, or Z, it's kind of in the middle. So I want this to be mirroring on X, which is left and right. Now, if we want, we can offset that mirror. So if it's not exactly centered to your character, you can move it to the left or the right. And then we also have this mirror threshold. What is it considered to be left and what is it considered to be right? And so anything within that threshold should work. So if this vertex here is a little bit off from that one, it'll still copy over. So now that you have everything set up, there's really just two buttons that you can push. One is to paste green to blue bones or paste green to blue vertices. Now we can paste green to blue or blue to green. We also can do what's called a mirror paste, where you select just one portion of that skeleton. So you select an envelope or a vertice and you can paste it to its complementary opposite. So we're actually just going to go from left to right. So one of the first things I'm going to do is just paste blue to green bones. And when I do that, look what happens to this. Remember how this was a normal envelope that looks something like this, but now those envelopes are completely the same, which is awesome. And so let's go back into mirror mode and let's turn on vertices under edit envelopes. And let's go ahead and select the vertices we want to mirror. Now this will mirror vertex weight. So I want to just get 1/2 of that character. So we're at about there. And then just paste blue to green. So again, left is blue, right is green. Go ahead and paste that. And now if I turn off the character, maybe even turn on mesh smooth here, you can now see how this deformation works. So now that leg is a lot better than it was before. So now that I've mirrored everything from one side to the other, I have a complete character. Now, in order to finalize this, I can certainly go back into my material editor and turn on the material so we can see exactly how this character looks. Let's turn off edged faces. And so now you can see how this character is deforming, and that looks pretty good. So once you have everything in place, you should have a good character that you can animate. Now that we have our character rig, let's go ahead and start animating it. Now we're going to take a look at the cat animation system. So I'm going to select this main node here, and let's hop over to the motion panel. And you should see something like this. So we have an assign controller as well as a layer manager. Now in CAT, a lot of the animation happens in what are called layers. So we've done a little bit of this, but what we can do is we can add layers here, and those layers will then affect the animation. So we can add a layer by this pull down menu. Now we have 4 different types. We have ABS, which is absolute, and that basically overrides anything before it and makes that the absolute position. We have another one called plus L, which is local. It's called relative local. And so what this does is it adds to the local space of a joint or a character. And this allows you to adjust poses. It allows you to create all sorts of fine adjustments on top of what we already have. The plus W layer orients that layer to the world. So this is for animation that is very global, like placing a foot specifically at a specific location in the world. And finally, we have this one here, which is basically an automated walk system. Now, with all of these, we've already gone through and you have to toggle this on or off. So when you toggle it on or off, the animation comes up. Now you can select any layer here and you can delete it. You can also copy and paste layers. And you can do a number of other things with it. Now, if you want, you can also take a look at how the rig is colored. And if you have multiple layers, you can also adjust those here in this window as well. Now, in addition to this, if we scroll down, you'll see we also have what's called a clip manager. So if you create animations that you like, you can save them out and recall them back into your characters. So these are just the basics of the interface. And so let's go ahead and dive into creating a procedural walk. Now let's go ahead and start animating our character using CATMotion to create a procedural walk. Now I've already frozen my character's mesh so that way I don't accidentally select it. And if you haven't on yours, you can always right click and then just do freeze selection or go into properties and check off show frozen in gray and freeze it. So now I can just select the different parts of the character. So I'm going to go ahead and select this main node here, and we're going to click here and drop in a generic walk. And then I'm going to hit this button here to play it. Now you'll see that this walk has a lot to be desired, but we're going to go through it a step at a time to get it into something that we like. Now we can do this by pressing on this little kind of like a paw icon here, and that's the CATMotion editor. And this allows us to edit our motion. So the first thing we want to do is click on globals. And this will give us some global values for our walk. So the maximum step time, the stride length, and so on. So I'm going to make this walk a little bit slower. I'm going to make the maximum step time 32. And then I'm going to drop the stride length down to about 120. She doesn't need to take such long steps. And I'm going to hold down Control and Alt, and I'm going to scrub my animation timeline until I get to 31. And now when I press play, it should loop pretty easily. Now, the first thing I notice is that her arms are straight out. So let's go ahead and rotate those down so that they're closer to her side. So I want them slightly out. Now, once we kind of have our character in position, we can start working with these subgroups. So we have a group for the pelvis, the spine, and the head. Now, let's start off with the head because it's kind of easy to understand how a lot of these controls work. So with each one of these, we have twist, roll, pitch, lift, and so on. Now, each one of these moves along a specific axis and animates along a specific axis. So this twist control, if I click here on offset, you can see that the twist is basically the vertical motion of that head. And right now she's kind of going a little too much. In fact, all of this is a little bit too much. So I'm going to scale that down to about 25%. And so now her head will rock back and forth a little bit less. Now roll is basically the left-right tilt of the head. And again, she's got quite a bit of that going on. So again, I'm going to knock it down to 25%. And then pitch. Now pitch is basically the forward back motion. And she doesn't really have any of that, but her chin is really high, and we don't want that. So instead of scaling this, we can offset it. Now, the first number for offset basically just offsets the animation. And we don't want that. We want to offset the value. So I'm going to go to this second one here, and we're going to tilt her head down. And now, if I scrub this, you'll see her head is pretty nice. But the rest of her body needs a lot of work. So we're going to go ahead and tweak that next. Now that we understand a little bit more about CATMotion's walk, let's go ahead and just adjust the rest of it. Now, if I press play, you'll see we get some really bad stuff happening with those knees, but that can actually be easily fixed. So I'm going to go ahead and select my main node here. Let's go over to the motion panel, make sure we have our CATMotion layer selected, and let's go into our CATMotion editor. Obviously, the knees are at the wrong angle. So we can find the knees under the pelvis group. So we have the pelvis and the legs. So I'm going to go over to knee angle under the legs, and we're basically just going to offset it. So I'm going to go to the second offset button, and we're going to pull that up to about 3, a little over 3, like 3.1, maybe something like that, or 2.9, something like that. And what I want to do is I just want to get it so that those knees bend properly at that point. Now, once I have this, then I can start working on these hips. Now, as you can see, she's got some really extreme motion in her body. So we want to kind of tone that down to make it a little bit more realistic. So this is all going to happen in the pelvis. So we've got a number of controls, just like we did with the head, such as twist, roll, and pitch. But the one I'm looking for is weight shift. So she's moving her weight left and right as she walks, and we want to tone that down quite a bit. So I'm going to drop that weight shift down maybe to about 30%. And as you can see, she moves. And so this means that her weight is not nearly shifting as much left or right. But we still have the twist and roll and pitch. So I'm going to actually leave twist alone for now. So let's go ahead and select roll. I'm going to bring that down to about 20%. And then pitch, we're going to leave alone. So now we're getting a pretty good walk. Now, one of the things that we can also work with is the actual position of that character's pelvis. So if I select offset position, I can adjust her up and down using X. So maybe give her a little bit of a bend in the knee here at the first frame here. We can also move her back and forth. So if I go into Y, I can push her a little bit more over that foot. So now she's a little bit more forward in the walk. Now let's go ahead and just keep going. I'm going to go into the spine group here. And so again, with the spine, we have twist and roll. So I'm going to knock those down quite a bit. So I'm going to put those down to about 25%. So twist and roll, let's scale those to 25%. So now she won't have nearly as much shoulder action. And then finally, we've got the arms. And so right now, especially right here, you can see those arms are literally bending backwards, and that's not anatomically correct. So let's go ahead and open up that arms subgroup. And this is adjusted under bend. And so what we can do is basically just scale this down. So I'm going to scale it down to about 50%. And as you can see, it bends less. If you want to give it a little bit more bend, you can always offset it just a bit. So I'm going to go ahead and offset that by about -12 to 15, somewhere in that range. And so now she's got a lot more of a natural bend to her arm. Now, in addition to this, we can also do what's called cross swing or swing. And so we can tone down how far and back her arms go. So if we wanted to, we can amp it up or bring it down. I'm going to bring it down to about 75%, just a little bit less. And then we also have the palms. So what we've got is we've got our hand flop in Y and X. And so that's kind of how the hands kind of come up and out. And then this flop here is forward and back. So I'm going to actually drop the flop down on X a little bit. Actually, that's not what I want. So let's go ahead and bring that back up a little bit. Now we can also scale that down. I'm going to scale that down to about 30% here. And so now we'll have a little bit less of that. And also, if we want, we can, in the palm, change things such as the curl angle of the fingers. So if I wanted to, I can make the fingers a little bit more curled in, maybe look a little bit more relaxed. So as you can see, there's a lot of different controls that you can work with on these walks. But if you understand the basics of which direction bend and twist and roll go, and then understand what offsets are, you should be able to dial in the walk that you want. So go ahead and continue tweaking your walk, and we'll come back. Once you have your walk in place, you might want to walk your character through your scene. Now, if I press play on the walk that we have, you'll see the character is walking in place. And that's great for getting the basic walk motion down. But typically, we'll want the character to walk through the scene. Now, we can do this in a couple of different ways. So let's select our object here, Biped 01, and then go into our CATMotion layer and select the CATMotion editor. Now, in order for this to work, I'm actually going to expand this out so you can see it a little bit better. So I'm going to expand my timeline to about 110 or so, just by holding on Control and Alt and then right-clicking on that timeline. And then if we go to Globals, you'll see we have a walk mode. So do we want to walk on spot or do we want to walk on a line? Well, if I click walk on a line, watch what happens. She jumps to that line. And if I rewind and press play, you'll see that she basically just walks through the scene. And that's great. Now, there are times when you'll want the character to walk in a path other than a straight line. And so we can also do that as well. So I'm going to right click and do unhide all. And you'll see we have this spline, and we'll use that to create an animation path. So what we need to do is we need to animate something along the path, and that thing needs to be in the right orientation for this character to follow. So the first thing I want to do is just create an object. So I want to create a helper object that won't render. So I'm going to go over to my create menu, helpers. Let's just create a dummy object and just left click and drag. And then I want to attach that to the path. So I'm going to go ahead and under animation, position controllers, path constraint, highlight the path and left click. So you can see that this is following the path and it's pretty much going at about the same rate as the character. Now, one of the things about this dummy is that it's not really following the path. So I'm going to go into my motion path and make sure I have that path constraint selected. And we just want to make sure that we follow that path. So now it's always pointed at the path. Now, we also need to have this oriented to the path. So typically we want Y to be forward, so that's the green axis, and X to be up. So let's go into a local mode. And you see right now I have X is along the path. So we can change that by selecting Y. And so that should get that. And then we also need to make sure that X is up. So I'm going to switch over to gimbal mode and go into rotation. And I'm going to rotate X at 90. So hopefully that will get it into place. Now, once we have this, all we have to do now is attach the character to that object. So I'm going to go back into my Biped 01, go into my CATMotion editor, and under globals, we're going to select the path node, and that's the dummy. And so as you can see, we got this a little bit off. So what I need to do is rotate this so that it is the right direction. So I'm going to go back into gimbal mode here. And we're just going to rotate her 90 degrees in Y and about 90 degrees in X. So let's go -90 here. And then for X, let's do 180. So you want kind of whole numbers here. So -180 and -90 for X and Y. And that should get it into the right spot. So let's go ahead and hit play. And as you can see, she's now moving through the scene. So if you want your character to move through the scene, you can either just move her in a straight line, or you can attach her to the path. Now you have to attach the character to an object already animating along that path, and that object needs to be oriented properly. We now have our character walking through the scene along a path. Now, when you do this, it actually creates what are called footsteps. So these are these little green and blue boxes. Now, this allows us to change how the character moves along that path. So if I were to select one of these footsteps and hit move, I can move how that character steps. So all I need to do is select one of these, and if I want her to maybe be a little bit wider, I could do that, or narrower. And this is really important for things such as stairs. So if you wanted her to walk, say, up some steps, all you have to do is select multiple footsteps and start moving them up. So now she goes up to that step. We select these, move those up. She goes up that step. And if we want, we could do one more step here, select these, and again, move them up. So now, not only is she walking along the path, we now have these footsteps that we can use to make her walk wherever we want. So if you want precise control over how your character is walking using CATMotion, you can use a path with footsteps. If you want to create your own animation, you can also do that through pose to pose animation in CAT. So, this is a great way to create things such as idle sequences instead of walks. So, here we have a simple character, and let's go ahead and select his main CAT node here and go over to the motion panel. And I'm just going to add in an absolute animation layer and press play. So, that button is green. Now, when we do that, we can pose the character and save out poses. So I can move any of these bones, but if I want to, I can also save out this initial neutral pose. So I'm going to right click on this, hit save pose, and then it's going to ask me to save a file. So I'm actually going to go into the browser here. And so what I want to do is go into my desktop exercise files, and I created a specific folder in my exercise files called cat poses. Now, that may or may not be empty, but let's go ahead and save this out as male neutral pose and click save. And now we're going to go ahead and click OK. So now that pose is out there. Now, if I want to, I can create another pose. So let's go ahead and maybe just drop his arms to his side, something like that. Maybe relax the hands a little bit. And maybe kind of change his weight so he's got his weight on a little bit more on one foot rather than the other. So I'm going to go ahead and move this foot out. I'm going to go into my Scene Explorer here, select this pelvis bone, and then kind of move him over a little bit, kind of change his center of balance, and then maybe even change his head. And again, I can do all sorts of different poses. So this is just kind of a really basic neutral pose. And then I can right click and go save pose again. So this one I want to call male relaxed A. Hit OK. And then if we want, we could do another pose, maybe almost like the opposite of that pose. So let's go ahead and select his pelvis bone again and shift his weight, maybe rotate him a little bit, make him look a little bit differently, maybe take this arm, kind of bend it a little bit. Rotate that hand. And so on. So maybe kind of drop that shoulder. So I can go on and on about this. And sometimes posing is a very iterative process, so it takes a little bit of time. But I'm going to go ahead and just right click over this and hit save pose again. We'll call this male relaxed B. So now I've got these poses out here. And if I want, I can load them up. So I can right click, do a load pose. Click on this button here and you'll see I have male relaxed A and B. And then I can mirror those poses if I want. So this allows me to save out specific poses for my character. And then I can take those poses and use those for animation to do something like maybe an idle sequence or something like that. Now that we have our poses in place, we can use them for animation. Now, I created some poses on my disk, and I'm providing them in the exercise file. So if you want to follow along with those, you will need to set a path here. So let me show you quickly where these normally live. So if I were to just open up Max by default, you would find all of your poses under your username, Autodesk, 3ds Max 2022 user settings, and that's on your main disk. And under CAT, you would have all of your poses. Now, I've provided those in the exercise file, so we're going to have to path to a different folder that I provided. So under Customize, Configure User and System Paths, I want to go to User Settings and change it from what it is to the exercise files folder on my desktop. Once that's set, it should work. So let's go ahead and select our character. And we're going to select that main node and go over to the motion panel. Let's go ahead, select absolute, add that layer, and press play. So now once I have this, I can start animating. So I want to make sure that auto key is turned on. And then as I load poses, it will key those poses. So let's go ahead and right click, go load pose. If I want, I can load this neutral pose or a relaxed pose. So when I load a rig pose, I can load it at a time. I can mirror or unmirror that pose. So I'm going to keep this unmirrored and then click OK. So now this pose is in place. So I'm going to go ahead and slide my time slider over. Let's go ahead and slide it over to maybe about 30 and then load another pose. Now, if we want to make this character look like he's kind of just standing around, we kind of want him to move within the poses that we have. So I actually put in a second pose here called Pose Relaxed A1. So this is Relaxed A, and this is A1. So notice there's just some subtle shifts in that character. So if I load that up and click OK, you'll see that now this character is just animating between those two poses. Let's go to, say, frame 60 and load another pose. So we're switching between relaxed A and A1, but let's go to relaxed B or B1 here. Let's go ahead to B. And again, we want to load that at 60 and click OK. So now he's kind of idling there, and then he goes over to here. And let's load one more pose at 90, and then we're going to go B1. So now I have some animation. And so if I want, I can kind of just keep him in these poses, and he'll subtly idle in those poses. Now, if I want, I can also animate on top of these poses. So what this has done is it's literally just put in keys for every joint in the body. If I want to, I can change any one of those keys, or I can add additional animations. So let's say when he does this shift, I want to kind of get an in between here to kind of get a little bit more natural motion here. So I'm going to go to frame 45. And I'm going to go into my Scene Explorer. Let's go ahead and select that pelvis bone. And I'm going to drop the hips a little bit right there. Now, I still have auto key on, so it should key that. So now, as he moves, he drops his hips just a little bit, maybe even a little bit too much, but just enough to get a nice shift in weight. Now, if I want, I could say take the head and maybe dip the head too. So now as he moves, he dips his head. And so as you can see, we've got a lot of different tools for animating characters pose to pose or just by adding keys on the timeline. And this is a great way to create simple animations for your characters. In CAT, because we have standardized skeletons, we can move things such as poses and animation between rigs. So let's go ahead and transfer walk animation from one rig or one character to another. So in this case, I've got this character who's walking, and her walk cycle is 32 frames. So I'm actually going to make my timeline 31 frames here. So that's one cycle. And so all I have to do is just export her animation, and then if I import it onto a similar skeleton, it should go. Let's go ahead and select our main node of our character, right-click, Save Animation. So I'm going to call this Female Walk. Start time is 0, and now this is a 32 frame cycle. So end frame is actually going to be 31 because 0 to 31 is 32 frames. So let's go ahead and click OK. And that should save it out to our standard directory. So let's go ahead and select our other character. And in this case, I do need to add some animation. So I'm going to go ahead and put in absolute track, press play, right click, load animation. So now we can take this female walk, load time, click OK. And if we press play, look what we have. Now, one of the things you'll notice is that his hands are a little bit different than hers. And that's because I posed her hands outside of that walk. And so what we do need to do is just go into local mode here, select his fingers, and then just relax his hands. And that's basically just how I animated her. I don't have keys on her hands, so that's not going to transfer over. So now, once his hands are relaxed, we have a pretty similar walk. If you want to, you could go over his walk and customize it a little bit more so it suits his character a little bit more. But as you can see, we got that animation over very, very quickly. Now, before we go, I do want to go over one more way to rig characters, and that's using Biped. Now, Biped is something that's been with Max basically since the beginning, and it's still a really good way to rig characters for architectural animation and other types of visualization. Now, let's just go ahead and create a simple biped skeleton, and I'll walk you through the interface. And then in the next few movies, we'll go ahead and attach that to a mesh and animate it. So bipeds can be created in the Systems menu. So you go into Create, Systems, and under Standard, you should have something that says biped. So all I have to do is select that, left click and drag, and you can see I'm making a skeleton. And as you can see, if I go into my perspective view here, you can see I've got a basic biped. Now, in the Create menu, you do have a number of options. You can give it a name. You can give it a different type of body type. So we're going with skeleton, which is very similar to what we did with cat. But you also can do male, you can do female. You can also do what's called a classic, which was the original biped skeleton, but I prefer this one. And then we can also change the number of links. Do we want arms on our character or not? Do we want a tail or a ponytail? So this is great for characters just outside of humans. We can add more or less fingers and so on. So there's a lot of different types of controls that you can have for biped. Now, once a biped is created, most of the action happens in the motion menu. So if I select, say, the pelvis of this biped and hop over to my modify menu, you'll see there's really nothing there. And that's because we're going to do all of our work in the motion panel. Now, in this panel, there's really a lot, and I'm just going to cover the basics in the next few movies, but you can go pretty deep with this software. So it has a number of options here under biped. One is figure mode, which allows you to pose the character to the mesh. We have footstep mode, which allows you to lay down footsteps and have the character automatically walk. We also have what's called a motion flow mode, which allows you to mix different types of animation and so on. Now we can also load and save bipeds. We can also load and save motion from bipeds. And we can also keyframe bipeds if we want, and then we can also do a type of layered animation. So as you can see, there's a lot to Biped. And again, I'm only going to go over some of the basics, give you a taste of it, but it's a very complete animation system that you can use a lot in visualization. When you attach a biped to a mesh, you need to create the biped in the appropriate scale, and then you need to use figure mode to pose the biped. So let's take a look at how to do that. So I have a simple mesh here, and I'm going to go ahead and freeze the mesh, and then let's go into wireframe mode. And so what I want to do is fit a biped skeleton to this mesh. So I'm going to hop over to the Systems tab, go to Biped, And then I'm just going to leave everything at the default and then just click from the center and drag it up. And then I'm trying to get his shoulders pretty close to the shoulders of that character. So I want to get that height about like that. And once we have this, we can now start to fit that biped to the mesh. We can do this in the motion panel. So I'm going to go down to this biped rollout and hit figure mode. And what this will do is give me a way to pose that character into the mesh. So if I wanted to, I could select this center here and make sure that the character is centered to that mesh. And then I can start to move and scale all of my joints to fit. So we could start here with the shoulders. Now, one of the things about shoulders is that I do like to have them pretty much over the armpit. And so this isn't quite where I want. But if I want to move this, as you can see, if I grab one of these and move them, I get kind of what's called IK. And so I can position joints simply by moving them. But I can also rotate and scale them individually. So one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this biped left clavicle and I'm going to scale it. And I'm going to scale it so that this shoulder basically is above that armpit. So the round part of the shoulder is kind of above the armpit. And then from the top view, we can start to adjust our arm as well. So one of the things I can do is I can select this hand and give that arm just kind of a natural bend, but this arm really is too long. So I want the elbow to be in between these two edge loops. So we're going to scale this one back a little bit. Select the forearm, scale it back a little bit as well. And so I want this hand to conveniently be just almost the exact same size as the hand on this character. Now, if we want, we can position and adjust all of the figures individually. Some people like to just have one finger if they're not going to be animating the hands. You know, if it's a really simple crowd shot or something like that, you might not need full fingers on the hand. And here is the thumb. And again, you can move that. And these particular fingers came in with only one joint. So if I want, I can go into the structure of this character. I can turn up or down the number of fingers as well as the number of links in the fingers. So if I put 3 links on this finger, you can see how that works. And this thumb, again, you can rotate it and position it. Now, this positioning will take a little bit of time and effort, so it is kind of a back and forth process, but there's a few other things I want to show you. And one is that you can do symmetrical fitting to the mesh. All you have to do is basically go down to here to copy paste, and under posture, you want to double click on this clavicle. Let's go ahead and copy this whole arm. So I'm going to double click on this clavicle, copy that posture, and then we can paste posture opposite. And you can see the other arm basically just assumes that identical posture. Now, another way to do this is to just do it in what's called symmetrical mode. So if I'm in my pose mode here under biped, if I go up here to track selection, I can select symmetrical. And then if I select symmetrical again, I can basically rotate those, and you can see it's actually affecting the opposite. Now, I particularly like copy and paste pose because it's a much easier way. You just get one side the way you like it, and then you copy it over. So as you can see, it's very easy to fit a biped to a mesh. Now, once you have the mesh done, you will go out of figure mode, and then you can start your skinning process. Now, once you have your biped fit to the mesh, you can skin that mesh to the biped. Now, we had a whole chapter on skinning previously, so I don't want to go through all of that again. So I'm just going to give you some of the basics, and then you can use the same skills you learned earlier. So in this, we have this character here, and let's go into wireframe. Now, I've already skinned this character. So basically what you will do is you will take your skin modifier, apply it to the mesh, and then what you'll do is go through and you'll add in all of the biped bones. So when you select add, you want to make sure that you get all of the biped bones in there. Now, once you have it in there, you can actually use envelopes and do the same process that you did with the cat skeleton. So, for example, I could select the forearm, and you could see all the weighting for that forearm. In fact, let's go ahead and turn off wireframe and maybe turn on edged faces so you can kind of see that. Now, if you want to animate your skeleton to test out the rigging, you can also do that. So what you need to do is hop out of skin, select a part of the character, and you want to make sure that you're in the motion panel that you're out of figure mode, and then just turn on auto key. Now I am just going to go ahead and jog this hand a little bit, and you can see it sets a key here. And then maybe what we can do is we can move that arm to the side, maybe bend it a little bit. And now I have a range of motion that I can use to define my skinning. Now, once you're done with this, you can certainly just select those keys and delete them. Now, I've already skinned this character, but again, if you understand the process of skinning a biped to a mesh should be no more difficult than skinning a cat skeleton to a mesh. Now that we have our character skinned to the biped, let's take a little look at animation. Now, one of the things that Biped is really good at is walking. It has a built-in walk and dynamic system that is driven by footsteps. So all you have to do is select one of the biped objects. I'm selecting his calf. Hop over to the motion panel, and under biped, we have what's called footstep mode. Now, when I select this, the screen changes a little bit, and we can do a couple of things. We can create individual footsteps. We can also create multiple footsteps, and then we can create walks, runs, and jumps. So let's start off by just creating a few multiple footsteps, and let's see how that works. So when I click on this, it gives me this menu. So how many footsteps do I want? Let's say 6 footsteps. Do we want to start with the left or the right foot? What's the stride length? And how far do we want him to walk? If we want to, we can turn on auto timing, or if we turn on interpolate, we can actually give a number of frames per footstep. I'm going to leave interpolate off, and let's click OK. Now, when we do this, it actually lays down some footsteps. Now, you see 4 here, but there are actually 2 under his feet. So there's kind of a starting position there. Now, once you have footsteps on the ground, nothing will happen until you activate them. So if you go up here to footstep operations and say create keys for inactive footsteps, watch what happens. He now starts to walk. Now, these footsteps are actually active. So if I select a footstep, I can move it in or out. I can rotate it. And I can move it forward and back. So all of these will affect the way that the character is walking. Now, if you want more footsteps, all you have to do is draw them on. Now, we did create multiple footsteps, but we can also create footsteps at the current frame. So let's go ahead to say frame 80 and create some more footsteps. Now, this is just a way to draw footsteps. So all I have to do is just click, 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 and I'm actually drawing footsteps. Now, if I want to, I don't have to have those footsteps on the ground. I can select them and move them up. Let's say he's going up a flight of stairs or something like that. So I don't have to have them flat on the ground. And because they're highlighted in color, that means that they're not active. So once we get them the way that we want, all we have to do is activate the footsteps. So create keys for inactive footsteps. And now You can see not only is he walking, he's walking up the stairs. So this is a great way to have characters walk through maybe a building or an architectural site, but it's a really simple, straightforward way to get your characters in motion. Now, there's a lot more to this. You can certainly do runs and jumps, and you can also affect the footsteps globally to make them walk around paths and stuff like that. But as you can see, it's a really easy, straightforward method for animating characters through a scene. Now, in addition to just footstep animation, we can also do pose to pose animation. And that's just a matter of keyframing the character. So here, we can pose this character using a number of different methods. So if I rotate the joints, you can see I can do what's called forward kinematics, or I can select any part of a limb and I can do what's called inverse kinematics. So it's very easy to pose characters. And if you want to animate them, you can just use 3ds Max's standard keyframing tools. There is a few little catches, but let's go ahead and select that hand and scroll down. And so for keying it, you want the first key to be set here. So under key info, just go ahead and set a key. And then you can say move forward a little bit, and then let's go ahead and maybe use IK to position that hand. And if you want, you can then just keyframe as normal, or you can do auto key. So let's go ahead with this one here. I'm going to go ahead and select that. Let's go ahead and set that first key. And this time I'm actually going to rotate that arm down. So now we've got basically two poses. Now, just like with Cat, 3ds Max's Biped also has a pose manager here. So let's go ahead down here to copy paste. Now we have a couple of these: posture, pose, and track. So I'm going to select pose, and let's go ahead and just use this standard T pose, and I'm going to go ahead and do copy pose. And so what it does is it creates a pose, a snapshot of that character, and as you can see, it's highlighted there in red. Now, if I want, I can go to this one and copy it again, and this gives a pose 2. So now we have pose 1 and pose 2. So maybe I go to frame 30 here and go up to pose 1 and then select paste pose. And because I have auto key on, it will keyframe that pose. So now I've got this. So as you can see, the animation tools for Biped are fairly straightforward, and you can also animate your own motions using keyframing. And finally, another way to create animation is to use motion capture. Now, motion capture is kind of a tricky subject. There's a lot of things to consider when doing motion capture, but you can load motion capture onto Biped as well as cat skeletons. So here I have my character. Let's go ahead and select the Biped, and in the motion panel, you actually have a motion capture rollout. And I actually have a motion capture file here. Now, this is in our exercise files mocap folder. I have this one called walka.biped. Now, I'm using Biped files, but Biped also supports what's called BVH and CSM files. Now, the issue with mocap is that how the motion is captured needs to align with the Biped. So all of the naming schemes of the joints and stuff kind of have to align. So I'm just using one saved out as a Biped file simply because it's easier. So let's go ahead and just click open. And then it's asking me a number of different things. Do we want to do key reduction? Do we want to extract footsteps for Biped and for actually creating footsteps in the scene? And so let's go ahead and click OK. And let's press play. And as you can see, it's a really simple walk. But we do have motion capture on the character. Now, the thing about motion capture is you can see here there's a lot of keys, because what happens with motion capture is they capture that pose every single frame. And so there's not a lot of room for changing things. But if you get good motion capture files, you might not have to. So Biped supports motion capture, and it's pretty easy to set up once you have everything aligned. Well, that just about does it for this course. As you can see, it's fairly easy to animate characters in 3ds Max, but the subtleties of character animation go very deep. So, if you want to dive deeper into character animation, we have a number of courses on character animation. So, hopefully, you can create your own characters and add them to your scenes. And if you want to learn more, go ahead and check out our many other courses on 3ds Max and character animation.